let me tell you something that will break the psychological chains you didn't even realize were around your mind. The moment the anxious stops chasing the avoidant, the entire dynamic explodes, and not in the way you think. You see, for so long, you've been conditioned to believe that love means proving your worth. That if you just love harder, if you just communicate better, if you just stay a little longer, you'll finally be chosen. But here's the raw truth no one tells you. The anxious is not weak. The anxious is not needy. The anxious is a damn powerhouse that's been emotionally manipulated into believing they're the problem, when in reality they've been chasing someone who runs from connection like it's fire. But what happens when the anxious stops? When she gets tired of begging for breadcrumbs and starts feeding herself full meals of self-worth, when she wakes up one morning and realizes, I'm not addicted to him, I'm addicted to proving I'm enough to someone who never had the capacity to see me in the first place. That is the moment the tables flip. The avoidant has spent their whole life in control, pulling away when it gets real, hiding behind silence, creating confusion. But when the anxious stops running after them, the avoidant loses their supply. The avoidant feels the panic because for the first time, they're no longer being chased, they're being exposed. Exposed for the emotional hide and seek they've been playing. Exposed for the control they wrapped in cold silence. Exposed for the love they kept dangling just out of reach. And here's the psychological crack. The avoidant doesn't fear intimacy, they fear being seen. And when the anxious stops chasing, they are forced to sit with their own mirror. And that mirror is loud. Now listen closely. You don't heal by getting them back. You don't heal by proving you're the one. You heal by breaking the dance. You heal by realizing this truth. I'm not here to chase love, I am love. And anyone who can't meet me there can watch me walk. This is a heartbreak. This is a rebirth. When the anxious stops chasing the avoidant faces a consequence they never expected. Your silence, your glow up, your peace. And for once in their life, they're left wondering what it feels like to be on the other side of emotional abandonment. You're not too much. You were just too emotionally available for someone who wasn't ready to stop hiding. And now, you're not chasing, you're cheersing. And that changes everything. Drop A in the comments if you felt that shift in your soul. Subscribe if you're done playing small in love. More truth is coming, and it's going to set fire to the lies you've been living in. Because this is only the beginning. Do you want me to prep the next one? When the anxious stops chasing, the power dynamic doesn't just shift, it detonates. The entire emotional framework collapses because the one person who always ran toward the fire finally walks away from the flame. And when that happens, the entire game the avoidant has been playing falls apart in silence. Because the anxious chaser was never weak. They were the fuel keeping everything alive. The chase was never about love. It was about survival. It was about proving they were worth staying for. It was about chasing closure from someone who never planned to give it. The anxious person was fighting a ghost in a mirror, begging it to become real. But when they stop, the ghost can no longer pretend to hold power. The avoidant wasn't strong, they were in control. And control only works when someone else agrees to dance in the dysfunction. When the anxious stops playing the role, the avoidant stands alone, exposed with no script left to follow. Suddenly, the one they labeled clingy becomes the one who's no longer reachable. And that silence, that's the sound of power returning home. The anxious used to believe love meant effort, that staying meant chasing, that absence meant try harder. But the second they wake up to the truth that love shouldn't require emotional gymnastics, the illusion is shattered. That moment of clarity, that's when the tables flip and reality punches the avoidant in the chest. They never thought she'd stop. They never believed she'd stop, texting, checking, waiting, explaining. And now, the line is dead. The stage is empty. The attention is gone. What once was desperation becomes detachment. What once was panic becomes peace. What once was a woman running after a closed-off heart becomes a woman walking toward herself with fire in her veins. And that fire doesn't chase, it chooses. It no longer begs for scraps, it demands everything or walks without apology. The avoidant never expected the anxious to find their edge, but the moment she did, she became a mirror too terrifying for the avoidant to look into, because now the truth is staring back at them. You were never ready. You never wanted real. You just wanted control. But control dies when the anxious says, I'm done. There's no text coming, no call, no reaction, no breakdown, just silence. And for the avoidant, that silence is unbearable. Because the anxious used to over-communicate, overthink, overgive until one day she stopped, not because she stopped caring, but because she started seeing, and when she saw the cycle, she stepped out of it like it was a burning building. You see, when the anxious stops chasing, they stop playing small. They stop hoping someone broken will heal with them. They stop pouring into a cup with a hole at the bottom, and they start drinking from their own damn well. They start speaking to themselves the way they begged someone else to. They start becoming the love they were chasing in someone emotionally unavailable. And that power, that's what the avoidant never anticipated. They thought the anxious needed them. They thought they were the center of the anxious person's world. But the truth was the anxious person was never chasing them. They were chasing a feeling they thought that person could give. And once they realized they already had the power to feel whole without them, the entire illusion fell to the floor. The game only works when someone plays. And now the anxious person doesn't even show up to the field. No warning, no announcement, just gone. And that disappearance, it's not to hurt the avoidant. It's to resurrect herself. It's to breathe again without the weight of proving she's worthy of a love that never truly showed up. This is what happens when the anxious stops chasing. The power dynamic doesn't shift. It ends. The moment the anxious stops chasing, the avoidant begins to unravel in silence. The very thing they thought gave them power, distance, silence, detachment, now becomes the exact thing that exposes their emotional weakness. The avoidant didn't want love, they wanted control over how close someone could get. But when that anxious energy, that chasing energy, disappears, they're left alone with nothing to avoid but themselves. The anxious person was their emotional shield. Every time the anxious reached out, it validated the avoidant's illusion that they were desired but not required to reciprocate. The avoidant got to feel significant without ever showing up fully. But when that energy is gone, when the anxious stops texting, checking, waiting, over-promoting, the avoidant meets the consequence of their emotional distance. Control is a drug, and the avoidant was addicted to the high of being needed. It fed their ego, not their heart. But when the anxious stops providing that hit, withdrawal kicks in. They start to feel the absence, not just in the silence, but in the absence of being chased, validated, admired. The anxious was the mirror that made them feel seen without ever having to step forward themselves. And now the mirror is gone, shattered, and they're left looking at the broken reflection of their own emotional cowardice. The avoidant was never emotionally stable. They were emotionally evasive. They thrived in ambiguity. They created space so they wouldn't have to face real connection. But the anxious was always there, trying to close that space with love, effort, devotion. And when that effort disappears, the void becomes too wide for even the avoidant to ignore. Suddenly, the silence they use as a weapon becomes their prison. It's easy to run from someone who keeps chasing, but when the chasing stops, the runner has nowhere to go. They thought they were escaping responsibility, but what they were really escaping was intimacy. And when the anxious stops providing that contrast, the avoidant is forced to confront a terrifying truth. They were never emotionally in control. They were emotionally hiding. When no one is there to pursue, the avoidant starts to feel what they never let themselves feel, emptiness. The anxious used to fill that space with pleas, with explanations, with affection. Now the phone is still. The notifications don't light up. The attention has vanished. And for someone who lives in fear of closeness but thrives on being desired, that loss is a silent crisis. The avoidant never expected consequences. They believed emotional detachment would always keep them safe from accountability. But the second the anxious exits the pattern, the avoidant is left exposed. And that exposure feels like vulnerability, but without anyone left to shield them. They are no longer emotionally desired. They are emotionally abandoned by the very person they believed would never leave. Now, the chase they used to avoid becomes the silence they can't escape. The anxious doesn't reach back. The energy that once begged for connection is now redirected inward. And the avoidant watches the same person they pushed away become the person who now walks past them like a stranger. That is the beginning of their inner collapse. The loss isn't just about the person. The loss is about the attention, the emotional safety net, the certainty that someone would always be there. And when that net is pulled away, the fall begins quiet, hidden, but real. The avoidant begins to think more than they ever show. They begin to miss more than they ever admit, but it's too late because the anxious has stopped knocking on a door that never opened. The avoidant isn't built for loneliness. They're built for emotional hiding. But when no one's looking for them anymore, they're forced to feel what they never wanted to, the full impact of their emotional absence. And in that space, they realize without the chase, without the pull, without the constant reassurance, they are left with nothing but themselves. Silence from the anxious is not emptiness, it is transformation wrapped in thunder. It is the most deafening response to a pattern that once thrived on noise, on reaction, on emotional pursuit. The anxious was always the voice, the message, the call, the explanation, the emotional glue holding together a connection built on avoidance. But when that voice falls quiet, it creates a sound so powerful, it echoes through the avoidant's entire being. The anxious once filled every gap with love, every pause with presence, every moment of distance with reassurance. They spoke when they were hurting, reached out when they were confused, tried harder when they were ignored. But something changed. The silence isn't confusion, it's clarity. The absence of words doesn't mean she doesn't know what to say. It means she no longer sees value in saying it to someone who doesn't listen. Silence is not passive. It is power reclaimed. It's not giving up, it's waking up. Waking up to the truth that someone who loves you shouldn't make you beg for consistency. Waking up to the reality that chasing connection only deepens abandonment. And when that realization hits the anxious person, silence becomes their first language of self-worth. The avoidant, once comforted by distance, is now haunted by it. The space they used to control has turned on them. The silence they once weaponized now leaves them pacing in their own uncertainty. Because the anxious was predictable in their pursuit, and now there's nothing. No reply, no check-in, no validation. The silence is brutal because it's not empty, it's intentional. The anxious person's silence is the loudest goodbye. It carries the weight of every ignored message, every delayed response, every unreciprocated moment. It is not quiet because she doesn't care. It's quiet because she finally does about herself. The woman who used to speak to heal the relationship is now silent to heal her soul. Silence is no longer the avoidance tool. It's the anxious person's revenge. Not in anger, but in elevation. It's the graduation from dysfunction. The quiet screams to the avoidant louder than any argument ever could. I see you for what you are, and I no longer shrink for you. And that message cuts deeper than confrontation ever did. The avoidant waits. Maybe she'll reach out again. Maybe it's just a phase. But days go by, then weeks, and the silence doesn't break. That's when it sinks in. The game is over. The anxious isn't waiting by the phone. She's rebuilding her life. She's not avoiding contact. She's rejecting confusion. She's not playing hard to get. She's no longer available for emotional half measures. What was once a flood of messages is now a drought of indifference. Not because she stopped loving, but because she stopped bleeding for someone who never knew how to bandage wounds they caused. Silence became the closure the avoidant never gave. And now the silence becomes their mirror, one they can't look away from. The anxious person's silence says, I begged for love, but now I embody it. It says, you had my loyalty, now I have my peace. It says, you mistook my expression for desperation, but I was just trying to love out loud before I learned to love in silence. And that silence stings because it's wrapped in dignity. This silence has no need to explain, no desire to justify, no interest in reopening what's already rotted. It holds power, not because it withholds communication, but because it ends the narrative. The avoidant didn't just lose a person, they lost the emotional access they took for granted. And now in the middle of the stillness they once created, they finally hear something terrifying for the first time, the sound of someone truly gone. Healing doesn't begin with revenge, it begins with reclaiming your identity from a pattern that broke you. The moment the anxious detaches from the avoidant is the moment the spell is shattered and reality comes into focus, like lightning cracking the sky. The anxious was never born to chase. They were conditioned to believe love had to be earned through pain. But healing begins when that belief is buried. The dance ends the moment one partner stops stepping forward. The anxious person wakes up to the truth. You can't save someone by losing yourself. You can't keep bleeding hoping it will teach someone else how to bandage you. And when that hits, when that truth settles in the bones, the anxious doesn't walk away, they rise. There is no healing in constantly explaining your worth to someone who profits from your insecurity. The avoidant never offered connection, they offered confusion. And confusion is not love, it's control dressed in silence. The anxious person begins to heal the moment they stop trying to decode mixed signals and start honoring their own clarity. Healing is not loud. It's not angry. It's not a scream into the void. It's the quiet confidence that says, I will never beg for the bare minimum again. It's the moment she stops rereading the last message. The moment she doesn't care what time he was last online. The moment she doesn't feel the need to break her own silence for someone who couldn't handle her voice in the first place. The anxious always carried the emotional weight of the connection. They filled the silence. They fixed what wasn't theirs. But healing begins when they realize that love isn't about effort. It's about reciprocity. It's not about proving your heart. It's about being met there without having to scream for attention. When she finally stops reaching, when the pull fades, when the pattern breaks, she doesn't crumble. She recalibrates. Her nervous system, once addicted to emotional highs and withdrawals, begins to find rhythm in peace. Not in the chaos of being half chosen, not in waiting for texts, but in knowing she's whole whether someone sees it or not. Healing begins with boundaries that no longer bend for breadcrumbs. She doesn't need closure because the clarity came the moment she chose herself. She doesn't need revenge because evolution is her loudest answer. She doesn't need to show him what he lost because what she found in herself is worth more than his validation ever was. There's no apology for outgrowing pain. There's no guilt in refusing to shrink just to stay in someone's life. The anxious person finally learns that their sensitivity was never a flaw. It was their superpower misdirected towards someone who feared its intensity. Now that power is turned inward, and from that moment on, she becomes unstoppable. Healing is refusing to chase what runs. It's refusing to explain what should have been obvious. It's refusing to tolerate emotional starvation in the name of loyalty. The anxious becomes free not when they find someone new, but when they no longer look back at someone who couldn't meet them where they stood all along. The cycle doesn't end by hoping the avoidant changes. It ends when the anxious outgrows the need to be rescued by the very person who wounded them. That is the transformation. That is the rebirth. No noise, no drama, just a clean break from every version of her that thought she had to prove her worth through pain. Healing begins when she realizes she never had to chase love. She only had to remember she was it. When the anxious stops chasing, the emotional fog lifts. And suddenly, everything the avoidant tried to hide becomes visible. The avoidant was never a mystery. They were a strategy, a tactic, a defense mechanism, pretending to be depth. The anxious couldn't see it before because their focus was survival, not clarity. But when the chase ends, the lens changes, and the truth becomes blinding. You can't idolize someone's potential when you're no longer starving for their presence. The avoidance power was never real. It was borrowed. It came from your willingness to shrink. It came from your silence, your waiting, your tears. But when the anxious reclaims their breath, the illusion of power fades like smoke in daylight. The avoidant didn't lead, they avoided. They didn't protect themselves, they escaped intimacy. They weren't emotionally deep, they were emotionally unavailable and called it complexity to avoid responsibility. You begin to see it all with sharp eyes. The inconsistency wasn't unintentional, it was control. The mixed signals weren't confusion, they were manipulation to keep you questioning your worth so they never had to question their own behavior. The emotional distance wasn't space, it was punishment. And once the anxious person stops chasing, those games lose their power because they no longer work on someone who refuses to participate. The avoidant's entire identity rested on being chased. They built walls and waited to be worshipped for having them. They created chaos and expected praise for giving crumbs of peace. But when you stop showing up to fix what they broke, their mask begins to fall. And underneath it isn't strength, it's fear. Fear of being seen, fear of being known, fear of being loved and held accountable at the same time. The avoidant isn't emotionally superior, they're emotionally terrified. They want closeness without vulnerability, attention without effort, intimacy without consistency. But when you stop chasing, when you stop trying to convince them to love you the way you love them, you realize how empty their emotional offering really was. It wasn't love, it was fear wrapped in distance and sold as independent. The anxious person finally understands they weren't asking for too much. They were just asking someone incapable of giving anything to offer everything. And that realization hits hard. Because now the person you once cried over becomes the person you pity. Not out of spite, but because you finally see how small they had to be to feel big in your life. You see how limited their capacity truly was, and that clarity changes everything. You don't need them to explain anymore because their absence is the explanation. You don't need closure because their inconsistency was the closure. You don't need another breadcrumb, another maybe, another half-truth disguised as depth. You've tasted your own peace, and now anything that comes in chaos feels like poison in your mouth. The moment you stopped chasing is the moment they became visible, not as a romantic mystery, but as an emotional illusion. You see the patterns, the avoidance, the excuses, the deflection. And it doesn't hurt anymore. It exposes them. It lifts the veil on everything you used to romanticize because clarity comes when emotion leaves. And now, with distance, the truth screams louder than their silence ever could. They were never better than you. They were never more grounded, more in control, more self-aware. They were running from love while you were trying to build it. They were withdrawing while you were pouring in. And now that you've stopped, now that you've redirected your energy back to yourself, they are left to face the reflection they've been hiding from without your validation to distort it. You don't chase ghosts once you realize you're the light. You don't beg for presents from someone who only ever gave you shadows. You don't lose sleep over someone whose peace was built on your anxiety. You finally see them not through the lens of longing, but through the lens of liberation. The avoidant never thought the anxious would actually walk away because they built the relationship on the belief that the anxious needed them more than they were ever willing to give. They relied on the imbalance. They relied on the chase. They relied on the anxious pouring in even when they gave nothing back. But when the anxious stops, when the pouring stops, when the chase ends, the avoidant is hit with a silence that shatters their illusion of power. They never prepared for the day the anxious would stop explaining themselves. They didn't anticipate the moment when the anxious would no longer reach out, no longer beg to be heard, no longer soften their truth just to keep the peace. The avoidant always thought they were the one in control, but control is an illusion easily broken when the one who gave you power decides to withdraw it completely. The anxious carried the relationship like it was a life raft, constantly patching holes the avoidant didn't even acknowledge. But now that raft is gone, and the avoidant is left in the middle of their own emotional sea with no rescue, no anchor, and no one left to blame. When the anxious stops fighting for the connection, the avoidant finally has to face the wreckage of everything they refused to confront. The anxious didn't leave in rage, they left in awareness. They didn't disappear to hurt the avoidant, they disappeared because they finally understood they were hurting themselves by staying. And the avoidant, used to emotional pursuit, begins to feel the panic they never expected. Because the one who always showed up no longer does. The emotional safety net has vanished. The attention is gone. The comfort of knowing they could always be chased is dead. The avoidance ego begins to starve in the absence of the anxious. What once felt like space now feels like abandonment. What once felt like independence now feels like isolation. And what once felt like emotional detachment now feels like a gaping hole they don't know how to fill. Because the anxious was the heart, and now that heart beats somewhere else. Stronger, freer, unreachable. The anxious didn't become cold, they became conscious. Conscious of their own worth. Conscious of how much they were giving for so little in return. Conscious of how being too much was just another way the avoidant deflected from their inability to love deeply. And now that the anxious has unplugged from the performance, The avoidant no longer has a stage to play on. They thought the anxious was weak because they were expressive. They thought silence was strength. But now the anxious is silent too, and the avoidant realizes their own silence never held power because it was never a choice, it was a shield. And the difference between avoidance and healing is that one hides from pain while the other walks through it and transforms. The avoidant begins to spiral, not publicly, not dramatically, but internally, because they can't stop thinking about how someone they thought would always chase no longer cares enough to look back. The anxious has leveled up, emotionally evolved, and the avoidant is left replaying every moment they dismissed as unimportant, every message they ignored, every time they stayed silent, while the anxious begged for connection. Now, the avoidant is haunted by the very silence they once enforced. It echoes through the routine, through their days, through the spaces where the anxious used to show up with love, patience, and understanding. They don't know how to reach out without exposing their fear. They don't know how to reconnect without revealing their weakness. And for the first time, the person they thought they were emotionally above becomes the one they can't stop thinking about. Because the anxious didn't disappear, they became untouchable, not out of vengeance, but out of growth. And now the avoidant understands something too late, that when the anxious stops chasing, it's not a game, it's a graduation, and no one returns to what they've outgrown.